Hello and welcome back to Storytellers Behind the Scenes, and thank you for joining us today. We're so grateful to our followers because without you, we wouldn't be producing this podcast. I'm passionate about this podcast because sharing these conversations offers insight into the diverse amount of work that we do and the responsibility that we have as journalists to discuss situations that we've encountered throughout our time in the industry. I do want to let you know in this episode, we discuss some sensitive subject matters, including murder and rape. Listening might make you feel a little uncomfortable, so I wanted to let you know in advance so that you can decide if this episode is for you. But believe me, it is an extremely interesting conversation. Today, I'm introducing you to another incredibly talented producer who has accomplished so much in her career. Many of you have seen her work on investigative news series, especially one of my favorites, Dateline. Jamila Paksima Rowell is an award-winning producer who seriously worked her way up from an entry-level position and has become one of the most sought-after social justice storytellers today. She's currently the EP of an award-winning podcast, Sounds Like Hate, and she continues to create content that sheds light on sensitive subjects impacting legislation and the course of history. So sit back, grab a drink, and relax. I know you'll find this episode enlightening. Jamila, welcome to Storytellers Behind the Scenes. I have been in awe of you since that first time I found you on LinkedIn and reached out to you, and we met at a Wegmans outside of Philadelphia and had a lovely conversation pre-pandemic. And I've been following you online, but really haven't had the opportunity to sit down with you and catch up and hear more about all the great things that you're doing. So we really appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
You're welcome, Jody. I'm so happy to just do this. And of course, always support women in this business who are doing a good job telling stories, you know?
Well, thank you for being here. And I will say you're a rock star. One of the things that I do want to talk about is even in your LinkedIn, description, it says, I'm a courageous storyteller. What does that mean to you?
Oh, wow. You went right for it. Good. I do not shy away from difficult stories. And I think in a way, that's what I'm mostly drawn to. So they're uncomfortable subjects, they're difficult, they're challenging, sometimes they're investigative. But I don't let the process of either fear or the difficulty really get in my way of trying to figure out how to tell this story in the best way. So it makes people in my family a little crazy. Sometimes if I take on some things, we can later we'll talk about the podcast. That was a little bit intense. But I've learned that I feel like that this is a part of life that people live all the time. And I know our business of media has a lot of escapism, but I've always been drawn to the journalism and the really heavier news aspects of it. But I also just love people's stories. And my first feature film was about a young man dying of cancer. And that was really hard. And we spent his last year with him, but I wasn't afraid of it. I was sad he was going to die. And I really didn't want to be there the day that happened. And, but I still knew this film had a real meaning and a purpose to go behind it, So that's where courageous storytelling comes from.
Let's just roll back a little bit. I want to talk about how you got started, because we like to share with our audience ideas about how they could get started in the business. So did you always know that you were a storyteller as a kid? Were you interested in the creative world, news stories, current events, things like that?
I'll tell you, I think, I had a very big life traumatic experience that was sort of my trigger to get into this line of business. Um, I grew up in Iran, and my dad and mom, our family had to escape Iran in 1978, and there was a big revolution. And so I'm half Iranian and half American. My mom's a nice Jewish girl from New York. Dorothy Lefkowitz went to Iran and married a Muslim guy. And, our lives were always really exciting there, and my parents had amazing friends because my mom worked at the American Embassy, which is, was where the hostage taking situation happened. My parents knew everybody who was in that embassy who was, kidnapped. And anyway, the long and short of it is my mom got out with us, my siblings. There's three of us all together, but my dad didn't get out for 2 years. And I was 14 at the time. And we moved to New York, and we went from having a really comfortable, luxurious life in Iran to like moving in with my mom's Jewish relatives who were Orthodox Jews. And,
mind blowing.
how to totally mind blowing, totally different kind of experience. But, and I learned, all about the Sabbath dinners and separate pots and pans and all of that. And we had so many children living in this house and figured out how to do it, but it was a very different life. There was so much more freedom than what I had been raised with. And, but every night at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, I started watching Nightline with my mom and my aunt and my uncle. And that changed everything. And I became hooked. And so and I would say, now we're talking 1978. I was in high school in the 80s, early 80s. And I think back then, just like MTV, CNN, there was just a few other channels, but there wasn't what we have today. And so I never even envisioned, besides like music videos, that there would be some other place, maybe CNN or BBC or that kind of thing. But I really wanted to do international stories and international news. And so in high school, all I did was I actually went down the directing and of plays path, and so I could learn the behind the scenes of business. And then John Tesh actually went to my high school in Long Island, and he came in, and he was a local news reporter in New York. And that was also a big moment for me. I was like, okay, I think that's what I want to do, is get into news. And then I went and I studied television journalism and politics, and I've always wanted to do it since that moment. I knew like this was where I wanted to be.
So you had a calling for it. So did you actually work in news? Did you get a job working in news? What my first job was in production, but then I went into news because I had that calling.
Yeah, I studied it. I had some internships in college at a place called Viz News. I had an internship in London with them. They were kind of like the online version of AP for international news. And then they also worked with NBC in New York, and I did an internship with them. But when I got out of college, I couldn't find a job in television. I remember I sent out 500 resumes and a lot to local TV, which I really didn't want to do, but I did anyway. And I just didn't get a call back. I was like, what am I going to do? So my first job actually was with AC Nielsen. I was like, it's the closest thing I could find to TV, and it was like 2 blocks away from NBC. So I was like, all right, I'll take this job. I was a secretary there, and I was actually in a consumer division. I wasn't even there 3 months. That job was in PR, and I was booking TV shows and all that, people getting all our clients on. And I worked for, one of my clients was P&G, which was really big, Pantene shampoo, and all these other big clients. And I really didn't want it, but a friend of mine from college was at NBC and said, do you know the Wang computer? Do you know how to use that? And I had learned that at that PR agency. And I actually had gotten promoted to an account, executive in like 1 year, had a secretary too. And they had this job with the Today Show to answer fan mail for Willard Scott and hate mail for Brian Gumbel. And I gave up my job, I gave up my secretary, and I went and I started sending out form letters. That was my big break.
But that was a springboard to your career, because a lot of us will do almost anything, right?
Right.
To get that door. And somebody opened a door for you and you took advantage of it and you walked in. That's pretty amazing. That had to be difficult, though.
Sure. I mean, it wasn't what I wanted to do, but I was like, okay. All I knew was I was way happier being in a space where production was happening. And then it was up to me to try to figure out a path for myself, because I actually would send out like several thousand letters a day. It was crazy. What the reason I got hired, because there was this memo that Brian Gumbel wrote that got released, and it really created such a flurry of like a PR mess for them, and they needed to figure out how to do it. And I would once a day get to go downstairs to the executive producer's office and hand him all these letters I printed out, and he would sign them one by one. And I was like, how am I going to get him to believe like I should work on a show? Like, this is very different, because they'd stick me back up on the 48th floor to type all these letters and then come back down to Today's Show for a minute. But through the grapevine, like, I just did the best I could. Like, I was eager, ready, and suddenly another opportunity opened for a new program with Maria Shriver and an executive producer there. His name was Sid Fetters, and he needed a research assistant. And I was like, I'll do it. I'll do anything. I'll do anything. I'll take that job. And that really became my foot in the door more than anything, where I started to really prove what I was capable of doing. It was a pilot. We did about 3 different hours, and that was my first big break.
But isn't it interesting how, and I talk to people about this, we've discussed it on, different episodes in the podcast. It's interesting how your PR background served you well, because even though you weren't thrilled with taking that job at NBC, responding to letters, you already had the skill and knowledge of how to interact with people and spin, right? And put a spin on whatever it was that you were writing. Not that it was you were trying to fool people, but then taking that skill and building on that allowed you that other opportunity to now work on a TV show. You must have felt like, the whole world opened up to you at that point.
Oh yeah. I mean, absolutely. The PR job that I had, one of my other clients was Ivory Soap. And I actually, when you now look back in your career you're like, nothing was wasted. Every single experience, is something that I learned something from. And I remember the biggest turnout that I got was for this Ivory Soap thing that we did. Was like an anniversary for them. They wanted to make the largest ivory soap in the world. And I found a sculptor in New York to sculpt ivory soap as a commemoration to different cities. So we were in San Francisco in Union Square, and and I learned so many phases of the process. Like, I went to the Ivory Soap Factory in New Jersey when they poured the giant 2,000-pound slab of ivory soap, and then, but there I was waiting for this big event to happen the night before, and the ivory soap had not arrived, and we really didn't have cell phones that were working back then. And I had booked the Today Show and PM Magazine, and like, this was going to be my biggest thing. And I'm literally sitting on a stage with like about 20 homeless men waiting for this soap to arrive at like 3 a.m. And it was such a production, but in the end, we really pulled it off, and it was like a huge hit. We got so much news coverage from it, and I was like, okay, this is, in a way, it is producing, but I still would like to have more control and be on the other side of choosing what and when. And I always tell that story because I when I was sitting there that night, I was like, okay, I am willing to risk my life for a lot of things, but I'm not sure ivory soap's one.
Well, I've had that thought a number of times working on talk shows. I've, done a fair amount of, backstories behind the
Mm-hmm.
scenes for the Dr. Phil show, Rachel Ray,
Mm-hmm.
and they call some of them, they're called knock and shock, where you like show up to somebody's
Yeah,
door and
those
knock on
are
the
hard.
door.
Yeah.
I remember when I did that, I was in Reading, Pennsylvania, and I realized while I was standing talking to this person that it was probably the craziest, stupidest thing I've ever done, because you don't know. I mean, I've been out on shoots where, husbands had threatened their wives or tried to kill them. And here I am, and, asking these questions during an interview. And I'm thinking, like, potentially this person could show up here, right?
Right.
You do have those thoughts in your mind about, why am I doing this again? Can you remind me? But when you're young, you know that there's a path and that you're committed to the ideal of getting your first job and making a difference. And as you said, this was your first big opportunity to really shine and show, chops, right? And show what you had to offer. And so that, I'm sure, was a bit of a panic moment for you when the Ivory soap didn't show up, but it obviously did eventually show up.
It showed up and we had an amazing event, right?
Did you have mentors in your life that helped guide you in your early years to say, if you want to do this, then maybe you should go down this path. If you want to do this, should you take this road instead? And then as a woman, did you find that you had any hurdles to overcome?
Well, I wouldn't say I really had a mentor, but I really admired a lot of journalists and I was following them closely. Barbara Walters, who just passed, she really had broken a lot of barriers for women, and also, like Leslie Stahl and a few of those women in news, I really would follow them very carefully. And then it was just by coincidence and happenstance that Bill Moyers is one of the finest journalists in my opinion, and I really, really admire his work. And he was the dad of one of my friends. And I remember when I was just trying to pick a college, I sat down with him one after he gave me some time. He was such a busy man, and he gave me his advice. And then after college, I met him again one time, and he just said, just go after the things that you believe in. And so I did that, and I've really from afar kept watching what he was working on, and it was just the highest caliber of journalism in our business for television, news reporting and documentary filmmaking. And so I never felt like actually I was ever ready or to work for him. Like I felt like he really wanted me to just wet my whistle in all these other places, but I didn't stay in touch with him until one day when I finally thought, I actually think this story that I found is for him. And I went to him, and he actually bought it for his TV series, his TV show that he had called Now with Bill Moyers. And it was his for the 7th episode, and the whole show was dedicated to this independent doc that I did. And I did it, I had filmed it all on my own, but brought it to him like ready to edit. And then he gave me an incredible courage. And that was my first independent project when I left NBC. So he
so
was
you already started your own production company at that point. You left NBC and just went to work on your own?
I'm leaping like really forward, but I ended up working at NBC for 11 years.
Oh, okay.
I wouldn't give that up for the world. I mean, I learned so much there. I would say that the executive producer, Sid Fetters, who I work for, he really was excited to teach me a lot about the business, and he was very close to Maria Shriver. So eventually he got to do a series for her called First Person with Maria Shriver, and I soon became the AP of that. And then they started letting me get down the producer track. And it was really exciting times for us at NBC. And that's when Dateline had just started in the early 1992 is when it started. Today, Dateline is 31 years old. It's like one of the most successful brands besides 60 Minutes. And NBC had made a decision to consolidate like all the different news magazine specials all under Dateline when it started becoming very successful. And so I got swept into Dateline, and I worked for Dateline for about 6 or 7 years, and that place changed me. I mean, I think I work with some of the greatest storytellers I've ever met there. And they also, to this day are some of my core connections. All of us who work together I think at one point the staff was over 300 people. We really help each other and take care of each other in this business. And they're some of my closest connections. And Neil Shapiro was running it, and I still do work for him. Now he's at WNET. But that was a remarkable operation. And I learned so much about how to scale and take on this work and how to crash and all of it. Investigative work. He just put us all to the test, and it was a great place to learn.
Dateline is one of the earliest shows I watched. I mean, I watched 60 Minutes. I actually always had an interest in local news as well as international news. I was very interested to see what was going on in the community and understanding about the underserved community. And I think that was really my first kind of pull toward working in news.
Mm-hmm.
And I did work in local news, an ABC affiliate in West Palm Beach.
Oh, wow.
And I was working there when the Challenger exploded. That was insane. And Peter Jennings was the host of ABC, their national news at the time. And I considered moving to New York and going into news, but I ended up, taking a different direction. But I've always, it was always on my radar. Like if you asked me when I was in high school or just starting college, I wanted to be the executive producer of like a Dateline or something.
Mm-hmm.
And, my life just took me into another direction. And I often wonder if I would have had sort of the internal strength. I mean, you were there 11 years. That's a long time. And news can be brutal, as you know. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. You know better than I do. But the stories that come through and that used to come over the AP wire, and we would see footage that never even hit the air, that people never saw the light of day. Tiananmen Square. I mean, there were things. I think that I was having some difficulty processing, not so much processing, but I couldn't let it go at night. When I wanted to go to bed, my brain was just crazy. And I started as a news editor. So all that raw footage would come back into my edit bay, and whether it was, a child that was killed or raped or whatever it was. And I just had an unsettled feeling. How did you manage your own feelings and sort of compartmentalize them? Because you really need to do that in news, I've learned.
Oh, you have to. And I think, I don't know if I've always done a good job of compartmentalizing it. I mean, it can become very all-consuming, especially when you work on a long form documentaries that with this content for like years and years. But I also learned that you have to be very like the ethics around what you share and don't share publicly is a responsibility of journalists. And I learned that. I remember the first really big crash like at NBC that I was involved in, it was the Gulf War. And they actually had us up for like 3 days straight because it just happened so quickly. And we weren't set up as a news operation in any way, like CNN, to go 24/7 news, but that's what happened. And there was all kinds of propaganda also being shared. And I wasn't aware of that, being naive young journalist. And literally, like, some tapes arrived at NBC and they were like, look at this and see what it is. And we don't know even who it's from, but they said for the news department. And so they sent me to a little edit bay to take a look at it. It was the most graphic scenes of children who'd been murdered.
Mm.
And they were saying that this is what America has done, and I had never seen anything so horrific in my life.
Yeah.
And
it's still in your brain, isn't it?
Yeah, it still is. And at first I was like, this has to get on the news. And then, I was watching all the debate going on around it. Here I am, just like, I was the first eyes on it at NBC. And, the seasoned journalists, they were like, well, we don't know who it's from. We don't know who staged it. We can't share any of this. And then you're like, well, if America is actually, bombing places filled with children, we better know what we're doing, and that it was just really one of those things that I think it was just so intense and there was so much going on. It just got pushed to the back burner and nobody pursued it. And I always wonder about those kinds of things, but I don't forget them because what I've learned over time is we can easily be manipulated as journalists too. And that was probably the smartest decision of the executive producers at the time, because I don't think it belonged on TV. When sometimes the beheadings and all these things that happen,
it's way too graphic.
It's so graphic. But separately, like I started working on a lot of stories around rape when I was at Dateline, and serial rapists and all these really, the criminals behind and what's happened behind their mind. And I would have nightmares sometimes actually about this stuff. And I actually had to even go and have some therapy around it because I didn't know how much it was impacting me. So now as, a little more seasoned person, I know it takes a little bit more time. You have to figure out how to balance yourself, how much of this content you want to be around. And do you have something else to balance it out? Because it's unhealthy for any human being to be around this kind of content all the time. I always wonder about people in NGOs who do this work day in and night, how they do it, because you cannot say it doesn't impact you. It does.
Absolutely. I mean, it's some of it is so gruesome, and again, just trying to have that inner strength to separate yourself from what you're seeing, but because of having that additional information, I think it does raise your fears just in general. Could something like this happen here? Could this, as a parent, you think, I know a lot more now, obviously, than I did when I was in news, but then you think about those things because you have that information that's still part of your data bank in your brain, right? It's not something that ever gets erased from your mind. So I give you a lot of credit for hanging in there for all those years. And, I've worked on some graphic stories and I really understand. I remember working on the mob trials, even when I worked in Fox in Philadelphia. And we were providing a lot of national stories.
I worked on those too for Dateline. The Philly mob.
Yeah.
Joey Merlino and all those guys.
Joey Merlino and the VZ trial. And I remember listening to the recordings of the VZs, when he was on the stand. And it just was mind-boggling to me how he could talk about all of these horrific things that he had done and just be so lighthearted about it and just be unaffected. Whereas here I am, an editor, working with a reporter thinking, oh my God, I'm not going to be able to sleep tonight, because they go through every single detail, quite well, because you worked on it. But for some reason, I think not being able to see his face and just hearing the audio recordings, because no cameras were allowed in the courtroom during those hearings. And you saw the illustrations, but the audio was so impactful. Tell me a little bit about how you use audio in your work to really drive your storytelling. Because, they say a picture tells 1,000 words, or says whatever the right saying is. But I really am very audio oriented. Sound to me, and sound design is so important when you're telling a story. You could just use sound and really not have a picture, which is why podcasts are so successful.
Right. I mean, I have, a podcast called Sounds Like Hate, and I produce it with for the Southern Poverty Law Center, which works to dismantle hate in America. And so we have not shied away from difficult stories there at all. And I basically brought my documentary hat to this and said, okay, let me explore audio in a new way. And this, since prior to the pandemic, I mean, we landed this opportunity with my co-executive producer, Geraldine Mariba, who was my office mate at Dateline. all roads go back to Dateline. This opportunity came to us because Geraldine had been pushing for a while, that they should probably consider this. And so once we landed the deal and we got the whole thing, they said, wow, we have this incredible trove of audio. And they had 87 hours of recruiting audio phone calls for a neo-Nazi group, of how they were recruiting young men around the country, around the world, actually. And that's a lot of audio.
That's a lot of audio.
And they were like, can you turn this into a documentary? And I was like, holy cow. Well, we had to get an army of people to listen to every ounce of it. Nobody had listened to it all, transcribe it. And then everybody had aliases and so on and so forth. But, I think if you really, it's one of those things with audio, you can't rush through it. A lot of times with video, you can whip through all that content. Oh, that looks good or whatever. But it's really what moves you. It's when you hear something that makes your blood boil, or it sucks the air out of the room. You're like, that is powerful. And I have to tell you, I have learned silence is one of the most powerful forms of audio you will ever have. In the documentary I made, Until 20, which I also made with Geraldine, I think one of the best scenes we ever had was when we were asked to leave an exam room, and the door was slammed on us for a family to have a private conversation about whether to continue cancer treatment. But the microphones were on, everybody, and we walked out. And I actually turned one of the second camera around in the exam room, and didn't realize till later all of it was recorded. And then we got to hear it, and it was very moving conversation. And that scene in our film actually ended up in there twice, because it ended up being the most powerful scene. And it's literally a shot of the door and listening to the conversation. And I was like, this is one of the most creative moments we've ever had. And we had to get permission and so forth. But it was raw. It was it was a raw conversation that wouldn't have happened if we were in the room, but we could use the audio. And so, I mean, I feel like between that and what we did with this podcast, with that ended up being what we could figure out 125 different individuals who were calling in on those phone calls for this group called The Base. And we kept whittling it down. And then as a team, we decided, okay, we can only tell a couple of stories. So let's pick the ones we find most compelling, characters who come back. Of course, there's the mastermind of the group. We followed him. And I mean, it's one of those, you got to trust your storytelling chops. We ended up making a series of 5 episodes because the young man we decided to pick down the road, at the same time we were doing the research, the FBI had infiltrated his cell and later arrested him and a group of young men who he had invited to come and live at his dad's like farmhouse. And I, down the road, ended up interviewing I was at the house like less than 10 days after the FBI raided it, interviewed the dad who didn't realize he enabled the entire damn thing for his son, and the grandmother who had been trying to stop it. And it all came from like this just random pile of audio, right? So the story, you start hearing these threads, and it's so much filtering through mounds and mounds of content, but we got a very compelling story out of that.
That sounds amazing. We'll definitely put a link to some of your work as well when we post the episode on the podcast.
Thank you.
When you talk about all of these things, and obviously this is after you left NBC, so let's just go back a little bit. You were at NBC for 11 years.
Mm-hmm.
What was the impetus? What got you to leave? Was it like, okay, it's time for me to fly, I'm ready to go on my own? Or did something specific happen? Or, you just got together with some of your friends and said, let's do it?
It was a confluence of different things. I'd been there quite a while. And from the beginning, always wanted to do international stories, and I was not getting assigned any of them. I think because at the time it was such a busy place and I was still single, I also felt like I was living on the road and had no control. And this was the part of news that I think I wanted to get to. You don't have control over what you're assigned in the newsroom and what time of day you've got to go out and all of that. Like I thought picking news magazines and long form would give me, some breath, to pick and choose. But really, when Dateline went to basically 7 days a week, we were, everywhere. And of course, I got assigned to things like the O.J. Simpson trial. So I spent like 6 weeks waiting for something to happen there. And, all of that. And I was like, it's because I'm single. Everybody who's got kids gets to stay home.
Do you think that's really the case?
I don't, It felt a little bit like that, and I also wasn't yet like up in my career, so I could not say no. There was always like so many more ambitious people behind me who would say yes. But the great part about what happened was somehow everybody thought I do have this sort of patience for going through a lot of content. And so I started gravitating more into investigative, and I got assigned into an investigative unit, and I started doing a lot more 1-hour documentaries, and I really loved it. So I basically thought, okay, and then I won a lot. I was part of a team that won a lot of awards for one, and my first Emmy nominations and that kind of thing. And so I said, okay, I think I want to do this by myself, but I want to go do something internationally. And so I left. I started my own production company. I quickly got hired by MSNBC to make hours through a friend of mine from NBC. And they were mostly crime-related hours, true crime and all that. But then I got a fellowship grant, and I got my first international story that I wanted to do. And it ended up being about, and I couldn't have done it without all the experience I had at Dateline. It was about child rape and why so many children in Africa have HIV. And it was a super hard subject. But I had already worked on and it was a Pew Fellowship grant that I got. And I think it was because of the experience that I had been around a lot of that rape content before. It was more around adults. That also helped. And I also felt like, I've really proven myself. I could do a lot of work, but let me do this. And then the cameramen I work with, they quickly trained me on how to film all this stuff because all those smaller cameras are starting to come out. And I actually filmed this whole documentary on my own. And I got sent there for like 6 weeks, and that's the film I brought to Bill Moyers, and that gave me courage to just keep on going. Like, that film was very difficult.
I just got the chills.
I ended up including the stories of 5 children under the age of 12 who were raped and were exposed to HIV in South Africa. And it was
Were
about.
you ever threatened when you were down there? Did people know what you were doing? Were you afraid ever?
I made one really big mistake as a freelance, independent person filming, and I had, luckily through the Pew Fellowship, we had gotten some training, but not enough. Like, I think I should have had, now I think more people are getting training around this, but whenever you're working internationally, you need to go with someone who's
You
local
need a fixer.
to the community where you're working. I mean, a fixer, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And I had a fixer one day, and I was in the Black Township, and we were filming these twin sisters that had gotten gang raped. And it was their first day out. They were going to church to sing, and we were filming in this tented church for a couple of hours. But my AP was a white South African woman, and it was, I didn't really have the budget for a big fixer, but the uncle of these young girls said he would bring us into the community and take us out. And across from that church, I was watching all these young men playing soccer in between. Like, this church service went on for about 3 hours. It was really long. And I was like, well, let me get a couple of shots of these guys playing soccer. But I had already dropped off the uncle. And I said, to Nikki, I go, what do you think? Can I just get one quick shot of these guys? There was like 100 people standing there, and we jumped out of the car, and I could feel it was happening. 2 men started walking towards us. I jumped back in the car. The whole thing is recorded on audio, believe it or not. So I threw the camera in the back seat. I'm like, they're going to go for the camera, and got into my head. It was the stupidest thing I ever did. It was so bad. And I learned from that. I've never, ever done anything like that. I've never gone anywhere without anybody. And I'm such a stickler for it. And I tell all young journalists this story because I was stupid. I was really stupid, but I got the story.
But you were also young. You were what, in your early 20s at the time?
Yeah,
late 20s?
Later 20s. But, and I was in a very unfamiliar place. And we got out of that situation very, very lucky. We were very lucky.
How did you talk your way out of that? Because that's not an easy thing.
Well, I think it was shock. I think we shocked our perpetrators because you don't know how you're going to react in a situation like that. And so the gun was against my head. Nikki was driving, and first they asked for our money, and I had my money under my shirt and like a belt,
money belt,
passport, and I had everything because we were going to another part of South Africa that day. We even had all our luggage in the car and everything. And when I pulled it up, he sticks his hand in and grabs everything. Right, I was happy to give him my cash, credit cards, but he also takes my passport, and I got really angry for some reason about the passport, and I'm like, give me my passport. And so I shocked him, and then Nikki yelled at the other guy, give me the keys. And they both stuck their hands in, grabbed a radio, grabbed a phone. And we all started shouting at each other. It was very bizarre. But somehow in the kerfuffle, Nikki got the keys back from this guy. And I just kept saying, I'm not going to be a victim of my own film. Like, in my head, I was so mad because of the violence in South Africa, especially against women and young children. And so Nikki got the key, and they have these disablers in South Africa where you have to stick it in before you can turn the key of the ignition back on the car. And she just peeled out of there. And you can hear they fired 2 shots. I don't know where they shot them, towards us, in the sky, whatever. We made it. I don't know. It was crazy. But I wouldn't recommend that. That is not the way you have an interaction with a perpetrator. Nobody would say do that. That's completely the wrong thing to do.
Well, you were in the heat of the moment, obviously, and, never had experienced anything like that. And how did you proceed after that? You took off. Did you go to that other location in South Africa, or did you take the rest of the day off?
Well, I completely profusely apologized to Nikki for putting her through that experience, because she lived in South Africa her whole life and nothing had ever happened to her like that. But it derailed our trip by a day. But it also, in a way, really informed me of the daily violence that people live with. And I sat there going, like, do I tell people or not? Or maybe I'll tell them when I get back, because everybody will be so,
Right. They'll be so worried.
Yeah. But we proceeded and we, persevered, and we went on. And then we always use that rule. And now if I go to very rural places, I will often also, either if I can't find someone who's ever been a fixer, but you really even still need somebody local that people really, really trust or fear. And you've got to vet that person. So I remember we hired police officers to go with us to do some of our other reporting during that trip in South Africa. And I mean, it didn't cost a lot, $50-$100 to hire them to sit in the car with you all day.
Right.
But it just is safety. And I did the same thing on the podcast. Like, I had to, we went down to the southern border of Arizona, and we wanted to interview some of these guys who are in militia groups who are sort of emboldening themselves and trying to help the border patrol, seize all these people crossing the border. And as two women trying to go and interview these people, it wasn't really the smartest thing to walk in there by ourselves. And I don't pack a gun. I don't do any of that. But I brought my, security person with me. And now I do that all the time. And I'm really glad I did.
Well, it's, obviously, whenever you're covering a story that has that layer, right? Because we're peeling back a lot of layers when we're telling a story, and the violence and the unknown, the things that we don't know about, even as much of the research and preparation that we have, there's always that area, that's sort of that gray area that, we're not sure how people are going to react, right? Because this is the real world. Well, I'm very happy to know that you got out of there safely. And I'm thinking that your parents were probably scared to death when you were going there to begin with.
Yep.
This story itself lives on because of the effort that you and Nikki went through, and were able to continue to work on that story and share it with the world. And you said Bill Moyers used that.
Right. So
in his show.
So I put together like a, little sizzle reel of what I had done in South Africa, and said, I think I have a film here. Would you consider it? And I mean, they called me in. They're like, can you get to New York right away? And I didn't know that he was starting a new show at the time. And they said, okay, we're going to make this our 7th episode. And what he did, which was really one of the first times that I actually started doing reporting myself, after he looked at it, he's like, I'm not going to voice this over. This is your work. Like, you were in the field, you were interviewing these children. You should be the voice. You went to find these girls in South Africa and find out what's happened to them. And I remember that day, like, I was like, I thought you would be like, the announcer voice, because I was so used to that at Dateline, and everything. And he's like, no, this is yours. This is like your investigative story. You're going to do it. And I was like, man, this man's amazing. So we did it. It was called Why the Children. And I mean, and I remember when I left South Africa, I said, okay, I've done it. I'm never going back. Right. So the project airs. Bill Moyers is so connected with everybody. He had Desmond Tutu commenting on my film at the end of the episode, and they had a whole conversation about, I mean, it just instantly got so elevated.
Wow.
And I guess some people from the Gates Foundation and Jimmy Carter were planning a big trip to Africa to talk about why antiretrovirals weren't being distributed because they were available. It was a big public policy
Right.
trip. And they saw the film, they asked for me, and Bill's like, you're going with President Jimmy Carter and Bill Gates' mom and dad traveling around Africa on this campaign and make a film out of that. And I was suddenly now going back to Africa. I've been back to South Africa like 8 times since, so that even though I got held up at gunpoint once, it didn't dissuade me, but now I just know how to navigate it a little bit better.
I've been to South Africa on a shoot, and we did have locals with us. And what amazes me is that a lot of these same issues still exist. They're
It's
just
so
not publicized. And when you drive outside of Soweto and you see the living conditions that these people are living in squalor, really, it's horrific. And a lot of, I would say, most people think apartheid happened and Mandela, was president and everything is all fixed. And it is not fixed.
It is not fixed.
But I do want to talk to you about the power of a pardon, because congratulations, you just earned 2 Emmys from that film, correct?
It's
Am I
one
right?
Emmy. One
Oh,
Emmy.
1 Emmy? Okay. But still,
But it was
amazing.
nominated. It had 3 nominations.
3 nominations. Okay. Talk to me a little bit about that, because that really is also a very interesting story. What led you to these 2 gentlemen? Tell us a little bit about that.
So, I mean, as an independent documentarian, I'm always like looking for what's going to be my next story. And I read a lot of different papers. I found that the first time I saw the story about what was happening in the Pardons Board in Philadelphia, it was a story in the Philly Inquirer. And it really struck me that Governor Wolf and John Fetterman had appointed a young man who had a felony conviction to run the Pardons Board. His name was Brandon Flood. And I was like, I think he's probably the only person in the country doing this. This is pretty amazing. I wish I could figure out a way to tell this story. And I just like put it in my little stories to pursue pile, And then the pandemic happened, and I get a call from WNET. They're like, hey, we got some money, a grant to do something around criminal justice reform. And I said, oh, do you have a story? And I said, yeah, there's incredible things happening in Pennsylvania. And I know you guys are like a New York PBS station. Would you do it? And they're like, well, this is a national PBS project. And so long and short of it is we kind of embedded in the pardons process. And I worked with Brandon Flood and got permission with John Fetterman and all those folks to chronicle it. And it wasn't that hard, but because of the pandemic, it was all online. And so we decided the way we would do it, we'd just like pick one hearing, and from that hearing, find the stories that we were going to do and follow the threads and so forth. And so we, even in advance, they kind of flagged like, this might be an interesting case. I wanted a kind of a mix. I wanted one that had to do with immigration and having a felony conviction, one that had to do with, drugs, like minor drug offense and so forth. And I wasn't really thinking about clemency, but in this hearing, suddenly Fetterman is like crying about this story about these 2 brothers who claimed to be wrongly convicted. And I was like, what is happening here? And so we did all the other stories, but I actually had to go and get like extra money from WNET to tell this other story about the brothers because it wasn't in the budget. And that is the one that we ended up winning for. And it's really a remarkable story of 2 men in Philly, which has unfortunately a huge track record of wrongly convicting a lot of people. And, they, these 2 brothers were actually both had applied to be Philadelphia police officers, and even one of them got accepted the week that he was arrested. But they both had squeaky clean history. Like nothing had ever, no crime had ever crossed their path. And they tried through various ways, and their mom and dad saved all their money to find them a lawyer they thought would help them instead of a public defender, but made so many wrong decisions along the path. And lo and behold, about 27 years go by, and they have been in prison that long. And what they decided, I think, after the first few years of being frustrated and angry was like, okay, we didn't do it, but how are we going to have a life in here and make it meaningful and purposeful? And they both had these different leadership qualities, and they kind of have done an amazing job inside the prison, helping transform it through programming for men, how to deal with anger. They ended up being like the team that would come in with CERT teams when there was going to be like a riot or something. They could calm people down. They started writing plays, all these other things. And by the end of it, like when they had their hearing, the warden's like, these two men, I would live next door to these two men. These men have done nothing. These men deserve to be free. And they saved so many people, and they actually calmed down the prison system in Pennsylvania. And I think it's because of the value of the work that they did that helped them gain their freedom, because they were charged with second-degree murder. They weren't even like the main mastermind, accused of being the main mastermind. They were just like driving the car was the claim. And literally, they just picked up a friend, and they didn't know he had murdered somebody. And that's how they got swept up in this thing. Yeah.
And spent 27 years in prison.
Yeah. Yeah. And they couldn't prove their wrongful conviction either, because the record keeping at the DA's office was so bad. Like they had been told they had been offered plea deals, and they wouldn't take plea deals because they were innocent. And they were like, we're not taking a plea deal. We're innocent. So now the gentleman who actually shot someone in this bar got out because he served his time, and because they denied that they had done anything, they had a longer sentence than him. And in Pennsylvania, it's life without parole. There is no other way out unless you can overturn your case or get a pardon. And so this story is so amazing to me, and I feel like it's, I'm hoping to continue to work with these two brothers to really tell it fully. But that's the story that we went for, because I had never heard of such a thing before. And I also didn't realize how many siblings, fathers and sons are in the Pennsylvania prison system. And it's,
wow,
it says a lot about society and why.
It's heartbreaking.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was really remarkable. And I will tell you, like, so then I became sort of, you're not supposed to be, but I became a John Fetterman fan. And then these two guys now have worked for John Fetterman after they left, when they got out. And so they've helped him campaign a lot in Philly. And they continue to do this work. They actually are working with prisoners all around the country doing like peer counseling training. And they work with this really remarkable organization in Vermont doing that. I also was so frustrated in the beginning going like, how am I going to do this just with like videos from Zoom and all of this? But we figured out a way. And we did just a few in-person shoots, and it really worked. And that's the one I won the Emmy for after all these years.
Well, congratulations again. I definitely want to see it. And
Thank you.
We'd like to post the links so that we can let people know where to find your incredible work. So when you develop a documentary, many people go to festivals, right, to get their work picked up, because not everybody gets a call from a contact that has money, because a lot of the projects that we work on, we're working on a documentary ourselves, are passion projects that we sometimes fund ourselves, or we start the kickoff out of our own pocket and then do crowdfunding and things like that. What is your path, or have you taken that path? And how do you pick and choose crowdfunding sources or which festivals to go to?
Well, I've done a mix of everything. I've done the festival path, and then I've done quite a bit for television. Um, and I generally will go if I see a story I like and I know like it can't wait, I do start to film it because I don't want to lose the opportunity of being in the moment. Some stories you just can't wait, right? Or at least you got to shoot a couple of scenes. Um, I mean, I think it's a horrible model just trying to make documentaries that, like the way this, I'm in awe of, narrative films that get millions and millions of dollars and we're like scrounging for a few $100,000 to tell important stories. Um, and I think each one's really different because each audience is very different. I do, like right now I have a mix actually of all 4 active projects. One I started filming 2 years ago because I had a hunch it's going to be a story, and put some of my own funding into it. And then others, like I also do documentaries for either corporate or nonprofit. And they are starting to get a lot bolder with the subjects that they take on. And I have been, and after I did like all those stories about HIV AIDS, I had this amazing opportunity to do a lot of storytelling for Johnson and Johnson. They sent me around the world telling healthcare reform stories, and that was great. So sometimes you can actually get a corporate sponsor, or and I did a lot of work for Janssen Pharmaceuticals connected to that. And then there's applying for documentary grants. And sometimes if things are really controversial, it's really hard to raise money for that. So I'm working with a local director in Pennsylvania, Ben Kalina. Him and I have been working on a film called Plan C for Civilization. And it's about climate change. And it's about a very controversial idea to divert the sun away from the earth to keep it cool. But what are we going to do in an emergency? And it's about a scientist who's just trying to do the research and being attacked for all the work that he's doing. This one's been so hard to raise money for. I mean, it's crazy. I can't believe how hard it is. And I think it's a very valid story, and it's about the right to do research, and that it can't be squashed until you allow scientists to get as far as they can go. And it's finally starting to get, more traction, but it's a combo of like, we got a little bit of money from foundations, but we're basically knocking on doors and trying to find people who believe that, either in science or technology, to come alongside of us. So I don't know if I've cracked the nut because each one is so different. Each project has its own sort of mix of influences and how people are going to come behind it. But timing is everything in this business. I think you'll find that like you'll be working on this story and holding on to it for so long, and then that it pops for some reason, like now is the moment. And I feel like we're getting close to that with like Plan C. We've gotten this year a lot more interest in supporting us. But we have right now this great group of funders who want to give us $350,000, but we need to find the match.
Right.
Oh yeah. So here we are, like digging for this, right?
Right. Well, that's
and we're
always been the challenge with documentaries, right? Is that, they're not bringing in the big bucks, or I think there has been a shift though. Would you say there's been a shift in your mind with like the streaming, Netflix and Prime and things like that, where you have more outlets and more opportunity to get your content on the air?
I think there's a shift, but unfortunately, one of the big shifts has been it needs to have like a big name attached to it.
Yes.
And that's the most frustrating thing still to me. Like, it doesn't give independent filmmakers always, the
opportunity,
gravitas or the authority to say, like, this young person can take on this subject. It doesn't have to be endorsed by a celebrity, or you don't have to give away an EP title all the time to someone who's somebody,
Right.
But that is the biggest way things are getting distributed nowadays. And I think a lot of celebrities have caught wind of the fact, like, they can use their power to make documentary films. And I agree. it still feels like you have to get into the right circles and know the right people. And so, I mean, I've had my opportunity to pitch to Netflix and go up there and all of that. And I'm surprised, things I thought they would love, but it's just like, were there enough celebrities connected to the project?
Mm-hmm.
That kind of thing. And so I'm not dissuading anybody, but I think that you have to think about that. And, some folks in our business really don't want to have the celebrity connection. They really want to keep it like old school documentary journalism. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a choice you make. Like I could have taken a different path and pick a lot more commercial projects to work on. But at the end of the day, I've worked on everything I want to work on, since I've had my career. I'm really happy with what I work on. Am I the wealthiest person? No. And do I have to always figure out the next budget and the next hustle? Yeah, but it's okay.
But your wealth is in your heart, like you're rich because of your experiences, not necessarily financially, but you've been able to pursue your career the way you wanted to do it.
Yeah.
And you believed in yourself and you really pushed hard to get to where you are. And that's just incredible. And I give you so much credit for that. I'm in awe about what you've been able to accomplish. Now, are you still shooting too? Because basically you wear a lot of hats, right? Don't we all in production? Producing, writing, directing, shooting, Do you continue to wear all those hats or do you bring people along for the ride?
No, I bring on people. I mean, there are so many more talented DPs than me. There will be the occasional time that I have to go, get behind the camera and just manage it a little bit. But I really don't like to do that at all anymore. However, I do think like in some intimate scenes and moments, the less people you have in there, the better. I do believe that.
Yeah.
And like I at the same time I say like I'm not doing that, but I went out on all these podcasts and I was there with like the headphones and recording and doing all this stuff. And and there was a part of it I really enjoyed. Like I still think it's fun, to
hands-on,
to be doing the hands-on. But everybody who's ever worked with me knows like I am just technology and me don't mix. Like stories, that's different story. I love telling the stories, getting access, getting people to let us in into really difficult situations. I could get in anywhere. And then I really have started to love like pushing boundaries with creativity, like that with visual. And now I'm really hoping one of my next documentary projects is going to have a lot of animation in it. And I've never done it before. And I'm really excited about, just trying a new muscle.
That's awesome. Mm-hmm. And is that something you already started working on, or you're just still ideating, or you actually have started with an illustrator and designs and things?
This is a project. I can't really talk too much about it, but it's
of
really
course
cool.
Not.
And it's actually, it's another organization has been working on this documentary for a year. And then after I won the Power of a Pardon, they asked me what I would do to make it more compelling. And that's where I'm in the middle of negotiating the contract.
Good for you. I love it.
I actually we've already picked the animators, everything. And so I'm excited about that because I feel like that is a new space that's really becoming really big. And if we could, and the few documentaries that I've seen that have really incorporated animation, it's very powerful, especially for very difficult subjects.
Yeah.
It makes it much more palatable for people to experience it through animation. And I think it broadens the audience because now animation, there's adult animation.
Yes.
And, it took a little while to get there, but like there was that film Persepolis made by an Iranian filmmaker all about women's oppression in Iran. She did that film almost 10 years ago. Look, it's taking till now, but I bet you everybody's watching that film right now. And then there was one that was nominated by Academy Awards last year called Flee.
Yes.
I don't know if you've seen that, but that was about an Afghan refugee who was also dealing with his sexual identity, and it's really beautifully done. So I think like it's a whole new space. Um, it also I think helps with I'm also have another client I'm making like a whole series of TikTok videos for. So it's a gamut. I do a little bit of
Yeah,
everything.
that's great though. It keeps you fresh too. Don't you think it keeps you relevant to work on
Mhm.
different types of projects with different types of clients?
Yeah. And you're definitely in the TikTok world, you're trying to create like eye candy so somebody's actually going to listen to really important content. So I it I just like everything seems always to be a challenge, but I'm not too afraid to figure out how to take it on.
I think that's, TikTok, obviously, there's a lot of controversy surrounding TikTok in general. But I
Mhm.
do notice that, this whole, younger generation, like my son is in his 20s, and he's constantly on TikTok. A lot of these people are getting all of their information from TikTok or Twitter or Instagram or whatever the platform is. So, being a storyteller, it's important to be able to share your stories on all of these platforms. And you're right, it is challenging when you're trying to create a message in a really confined
Mhm.
space where you only have a very short amount of time to express yourself and make
Right.
your point. So I'll be interested to see all of your TikTok
Right. Well,
videos.
we'll see. I mean, I just saw this amazing information. Like, apparently, skewing younger, say 16 to like 24, 40% of the information they get is from TikTok. They
Yes.
use TikTok like we use Google
Yeah,
as a search engine.
absolutely.
So, I mean, I've also poo-pooed TikTok a few years ago when my son
Mm-hmm.
was swiping nonstop.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, "Mom, get TikTok off your phone. You're trolling me." It's like, no, I mean, like now I got to figure out TikTok. It's like
Right. A hundred
crazy.
percent. It is where they are getting their information, and
Yeah,
we
and I
can't
think we're gonna
discount
have to
that.
do that. Yeah,
Yeah. No, we don't have a choice.
I mean,
We
you
have to
want that
branch out.
audience to watch your film and get on, online to see it. So we have to figure out how to tease it on TikTok. You know.
Right. So if you were giving somebody advice who wants to pursue documentary films, let's focus on that because that really is, I think, such an important aspect of what you do every day. You do a lot of things, but so many people get disillusioned about going into the documentary
Mhm.
field because it is so challenging and difficult to raise money, or you have to take money out of your own pocket. From your experience, what would you advise someone coming out of college or someone who's been in our world who's decided, you know what, I'm going to pursue creating this documentary? What would the steps be in your mind? And what advice would you give them about not giving up?
Okay. Well, I believe that if you see there's a story that's a documentary that can touch thousands and thousands of lives, and you can't stop thinking about it, then I often feel like they call you. I don't know why these documentaries, they come different time in your life, and then do it. But I feel like the way to be successful is there's no filmmaker who's ever made a film by themselves. You have got to find your other people who align with you or believe in this story. And I've been so lucky because I've worked with so many great DPs, and sometimes when I find an early story, I'm like, hey, I don't have money for this. What do you
Okay.
think? And they're like, if I have a day off, I believe in it. I believe in your story. Like, they're willing to put a little skin in the game, and then I'm like, okay, you're with me. Now that's still a little bit of like groveling, but do that. I also think like there's now, compared to when I started, so much opportunity out there to get into early like labs and have your pitches like worked on and all of this stuff through lots of film festivals. And you don't just have to go to Sundance. There's so many other places that you can go. And I know a lot of young filmmakers who are getting their breaks and getting their training in those circles and these peer support groups. But the thing is, you will learn, you can spend a lot of time just applying for grants and applying for things and not actually doing the story. And so I think you have to find the balance, and you might have to have another job if it's really what you want to do. And the reality is I have rarely met anybody who's made a documentary that hasn't taken 3 to 5 years to make. They don't happen quickly, not feature length ones, or hour long ones. They're a time commitment, and there's a process to it. But I've also done, I think the thing is, what my first big one with the largest budget I had for was this film Until 20, which is on Amazon, which is about this young man, James Reagan, who allowed us into his life before he was dying of osteosarcoma. And I really learned about using influencers and in people's circles and how to fundraise for that film. We didn't have actually any money from a foundation, and we were able to make that film through connections, talking to people in his circle, our circles, and doing a Kickstarter video. And our Kickstarter video, I think, was the first big thing we did. We raised $87,000.
Wow.
And what I did was I went into that with my business partner, Geraldine Moriba, but we both put money in and we shared the risk on that film. And a lot of times people want all the glory to be the director or the producer. And I'm so grateful that since that time, I've shared titles a lot. I used to never do that, but I don't mind. It just makes the project better if you really get people who are going to work on it with you. And that one was very personal because my dear friend Geraldine had survived her cancer, and she just wanted to make a film that was kind of, giving back to and help inspire more research around sarcomas. And so, I think many films get made through a mix of funding, and you can't really turn anything away. But you never know who's going to give you the most money, and you never know who it is. And so, I was at one party where we did a screening of our trailer, and I had no idea. I was talking to the chairman of MD Anderson.
Wow.
And who knew he had given money to Sophie's Choice. That was his first film he ever gave money to.
Wow.
And he's like oohing and eyeing over how we filmed these scenes and what this looked like and how moved he was. And that man made it possible for us to make this film in the end, through his network of people and influence. And so share your story, tell your story, and you just never know who that person is you're talking to, but tell them your story and they might just come right alongside you.
I love that.
Yeah.
And don't give up, right?
And, I never give up. I think my next nickname is Persistence, Jamila Paksima Persistence. It's a disease I got from my dad. But I never give up. And still, as hard as some of the subjects are I work on, I think they're really important because they're usually require change or attention. And I'm always so delighted by the end of the journey. As hard as it was, we usually are shedding light on something really dark that needs to change. And I'm so happy to have been a part of it. And most people who work on these projects are. So, if your story has a chance to change something for the good, do it. That's what I believe.
And you have changed a lot of lives with the work that you've done and the things that you've accomplished. And, you're an amazing role model for young producers, directors, writers who are looking to, share these real world stories without shying away from difficult subject matters, which is never easy.
Yeah.
I look forward to seeing more of your work. Thank you so much again for carving out some time for us and sharing your incredible story. And we will definitely promote all of your work.
I appreciate it, Jody. Thanks for reaching out. And I guess my last caveat is you can do all this and you can still do it safely. So don't do anything crazy like I did. But
that's a great point.
Just make sure you just don't pursue a story alone. I think there's so much richness in bringing other people in to telling your stories, and that's a big lesson. So maybe that's my little byline. Because I like how you pick like a quote from each of the people you've interviewed, and I really enjoyed this interview. So thank you, Jody.
Well, thank you, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon. Thank you so much, Jamila.
Sounds great.
Subscribe to our podcast to hear more.